Hey everybody, it's Bust with our Heart of the Huntress Balance patch notes review. And so the patch notes have been released. They are over on the Play Runeterra site. The dev stream happened a few hours ago for me. The link to it is down in the description if you haven't had a chance to watch it. And we're going to go through and talk about our thoughts and feels on the current format, the changes, the buffs, the nerfs, everything going on along that line. And so before we dive in, for my daily followers, my regulars, I know that we've been a little bit short on the videos over the course of the past few days. Not entirely my fault. Kansas City had a windstorm roll through. I hadn't had electricity for the past three and a half days or so, and as you can imagine, that makes it a little challenging to sit around and make the YouTube videos. But the family's okay, the property's okay. More importantly, the kitties are all okay. No problems in that sense. We were really just inconvenienced by it. With that in mind, I did play in the Runeterra Open. Went 3-3. I was kind of happy with the results, all things considered. I didn't get as much practice as I wanted, and I was a bit frazzled with the change in rotation and everything, and so it kind of is what it is. Sometimes, you know, life throws a wrench at you. You have to do your best to dodge and make the best of it, but everything's okay in that sense as well. But over the course of the next few days, I have some family coming into town. We're going to have to accommodate them. That will also interfere with my ability to make YouTube videos, but into next week, I hope to be back to regularly scheduled things with a video a day and kicking that off as soon as the family is out of town. And so get out of here, family. I got YouTube videos to make and stuff. And so with the Heart of the Huntress balance patch, there's a few things I wanted to talk about it. I had a couple of design philosophy things I wanted to bring up and talk about because I think it's quite interesting. We are in this space to where Siren Song was so relevant. And I think that there was a lot of kind of highs and lows to that and kind of an overview. I think it's very interesting that at its core, the Siren Song meta should have been very unit focused, right? If your key strategy to your deck is to give all of your units +1/+1, that should incorporate a lot of elements of unit-based combat, but it really focused in on the meta around things that weren't champions, right? And so to my mind, the Legends of Runeterra is a game about the champions doing battle with each other, and if you have to kind of put the champions aside and say the champions don't matter, is that really a positive element for the game? And so that's kind of, some background on what I wanted to kind of come in and talk about here at the start. And that brings us up the question is kind of what is the main design theme of Legends of Runeterra? If we want to look at a game like Magic, at least back in its day, I assume the thing's still kind of going about its now. You have two planeswalkers, right? That's these really special wizards. The planeswalkers are summoning bears and casting lightning bolts at each other in this kind of epic battle across a plane. And so that's the idea with Magic, right? You're summoning creatures, the creatures fight, you cast spells on each other, you draw strength from the resources around you, and that's how you get your units on board, yada, yada, yada. That's what the kind of thing is. Now, with the Legends of Runeterra, I've never seen what the actual core thought of the game is, right? It's not our Nexuses doing battle, right? I don't know what the Nexus is. I thought a Nexus was just the kind of idea of a base to fit into a MOBA. And so maybe it is. Maybe the Nexus has some kind of great power that I'm not really keen on. But to me, in my kind of heart and soul, I felt like Legends of Runeterra is about the battles between the champions, right? And so we're assembling our bottom lane, if you will. We've got a deck that has Draven in it. It's got Janna in it. They're going to head down to the bot lane and do battle with the other bot laners, right? The opponent has their Yuumi and their Samira down there doing battle. The infamous bot lane combo of Yuumi Samira down there getting nasty and stuff. That's what I kind of assumed was the kind of core theme of Legends of Runeterra, but I'm not entirely certain. I haven't seen that philosophy really kind of spelled out, and this is a patch again that kind of made me really question what the thought and idea is behind it, in the sense that is the format supposed to be about the Samiras and the Dravens and the Yumis of the world? That's the thing that really draws your attention and focus in, or is that just kind of a thing that builds in to the strength of the Nexus or the strength of the units or the faction identity or whatnot? I'm not entirely certain. And so, I don't have a right or wrong answer to what the idea is behind this. It's just as we enter, the previous standard meta to where it was so heavily defined by Samira, that being a champion and being what, in my mind, the game is supposed to be about. And now running into this meta, which was divined by Siren Song, which is a spell that doesn't even really interact with too many of the champions in the game. I think it's kind of an interesting question, and I think that would make a very interesting design article or design video, just kind of stating what the game is actually about. But that brings me into my kind of next space as we were talking about Siren Song. And that's a card that I thought was a very kind of interesting format definer in the sense that Siren Song is a spell. Casting spells at each other doesn't really feel like what Legends of Runeterra is supposed to be about, right? That feels like something that's supposed to be kind of supplementary, right? You have your combat trick coming from Demacia, you have your fight card coming out of Noxus, you have your crafty spell mystic shoddy kind of thing coming out of PNZ, right? Each faction kind of has their own thing that spells can kind of do, but it hasn't really been the kind of defining factor of the game or the faction. And that was a space that Magic was in for a long time. Over the course of the history of the game, Magic was most certainly defined by the spells. We talked about it to a little degree about supposedly being about planeswalkers kind of interacting with each other, but for a large course of Magic's history, that's not something that happened. For some of you young folks out there that may not remember the days of old of Magic, I put a few fun decks that actually happened over the course of Magic. And so in the top left, we have the Illusions of Grandeur deck. It's basically comes down, you gain 20 health. Magic doesn't have a cap on health, so you go from 20 to 40. You have one card that lets you just spend a health to draw a card, and so you say, all right, well, I'm going to draw about 10 cards, and then I'll play my Illusions of Grandeur and draw another 10 cards, having 20 cards more than your opponent. Good advantage, but then the card Donate lets you give one of your cards to your opponent as well. And so the thing with Illusions of Grandeur was that once it leaves play, you lose 20 life, you lose 20 health. And so if you give it to your opponent and then it goes away, your opponent loses 20 health. And so this is one of the kind of like obnoxious combos that was around in Magic in its early days. The deck plays absolutely no creatures in it. It has nothing to do with creatures. It's all centered on getting this Illusions of Grandeur onto the board, giving it to your opponent, and then when they can't handle it anymore, they just lose the game. Other kind of fun combos in this sense existed down in the bottom right corner. I felt like the Tolarian Academy decks were fun to talk about, given the kind of prevalence of coins and karma running around these days. But if you weren't familiar with this, Tolarian Academy was able to tap for kind of like 5 and 6 mana every time. Then there were all of these other cards that let you untap your land. And so if you look at Tolarian Academy, assume that it's going to give you 5 mana. Look to the right at a card like Frantic Search that lets you untap 3 lands. You can kind of piece together that if you get to tap your Tolarian Academy for 5 mana, tap 2 other lands to get up to 7, then you play your Frantic Search, you have 4 mana left over when you're done, and you get to untap that 7 mana generation that you just tapped. And so you can get into these pretty obnoxious cycles of generating mana, and then you have cards like Time Spiral that let you just draw 7 cards at a time. And so this was another wonderful time during Magic's history to where you play decks with no units in it. You get to generate near infinite mana, and then the Tolarian Academy decks would play another card that just says a player draws X cards, so not only could you use it to draw 10, 12 cards on your own, you would eventually use it to make your opponent draw out the entirety of their deck and get the kill. And so this is kind of one of the things as to where it kind of drives home that idea of what is the game about, what is the kind of core philosophy, the core thought of what is supposed to be happening with the game. Is Magic supposed to be about generating these big spells and having these big flashy effects happen onto your opponent? That's not exactly what the designers there said. They basically kind of said, this game is supposed to be about the units, it's supposed to be about the battles between these creatures hitting each other back and forth. And so I don't have like the best example in terms of creatures, but you can kind of see the power creep that happened in terms of creatures, right? On the left, we have the Grizzly Bears, just a 2/2 unit for 2 mana. Up next is the Nomadic Elf, to where it picks up a more valuable subtype in Elf, and it also has this ability dealing with mana. And then moving even further on, you find a unit that just has even more stats, has Vigilance, so it can attack and block in the same turn, and then it also grows as the game progresses. And so you see this progression across the years as to where they decided units should be the kind of defining factor of each game, and we're going to progressively make the units stronger than the spells. The more kind of powering down, if you will, is readily apparent across the spells. Someone decided that Ancestral Recall was a fair thing. You spend 1 mana and draw 3 cards. It immediately got toned down to something like Brainstorm, as to where you draw 3, but then you have to put 2 back. And then it really gets toned down into the future once this kind of idea that units are what defines the game happens, as to where you now have to spend 4 mana at slow speed to draw 3 and discard 1. And so you got to see Magic really kind of take this course to where the power of units ramped up, the power of spells really ramped down. And where I'm really kind of going with all of this, I know most of you don't have a history with Magic. You're, magicians or Pokemoners or Yu-Gi-Ohers or whatnot, but I think you should be able to kind of follow along as to where we're going and to where, what is that kind of core idea that's happening with Runeterra. I called it, is it the champions or is it the champion's strength? As to where over the course of the past few metas, we've seen them really defined by high impact spells. The World's meta was defined by champion's strength. This previous meta we just had was defined by Siren Song. To a smaller degree, you could say the Samira metas were, to an extent, kind of defined by Powder Pandemonium. I don't think that's fairly accurate in terms of definition of the format, but Powder Pandemonium was an exceptionally strong card. We've seen some people take triple Powder Pandemonium decks into seasonals events and have success with it there. And so, is that what the defining moment of the game is supposed to be? Should these spells really be this powerful? Or is the meta that we had a couple seasons ago, to where Samira was just absolutely rampant everywhere, what, the kind of goal for the developers should be? And so again, I don't have a right answer. I don't have a wrong answer. My personal heart of hearts says that the game should be designed around champions. And if we're going to have a meta that's heavily influenced by a single card, I think that card should be a champion and not a spell. But, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's the direction the game's going in. Maybe it's not. I think it's just a fun little thought exercise, and would be something kind of interesting to see what happens with the future, and something interesting for the devs to potentially come in and talk about. And so I think the last kind of space to where this champions versus champions thing is interesting is looking at it from the perspective of the ladder and looking at it from the perspective of the best of 3 format. And with the ladder, I feel like you should really kind of be developing into a rock, paper, scissors kind of system, right? If we looked at this previous meta, there is some evolution of the format to where people are kind of figuring out what the best deck is, right? The first Siren Song deck was the Evelyn deck. That quickly got dismissed as not being the best one, and then Fizz really took over for the next week and a half or so leading up to the open event. And then right before the open, the Lucian Alawi deck really kind of popped off as potentially being the best deck in terms of playing Siren Song. And I think in terms of ladder, it should really kind of eventually evolve into there just being the best Siren Song deck, and then the rest of them are just kind of sub-tier, right? You can't have 2 best decks in the format, right? There has to be 1 best deck, and if you're not playing the best deck, you're playing something worse than the best deck, right? And so that's the kind of space that you land in on the ladder. But in best of 3, I think it's kind of interesting in the sense that typically in the space to where you want to build around something like Siren Song, the drop-off is pretty dramatic, right? And so the Siren Song Fizz deck may have been, the tier 1 deck, but then if you wanted to play the Alawi version, that might be tier 1.5, and then somewhere down below that into tier 2 with Evelyn, you have to want to really bring Siren Song if you're willing to bring that kind of thing, right? To where maybe if you're playing just good decks in the best of 3, you get to play the Fizz deck at tier 1, but then maybe Karma Set is kind of like tier 1.1, maybe the Gen Bandle City deck is kind of tier 1.2, and you're just playing the 3 absolute best decks of the format, to where our previous kind of example was really dropping down the tier list in terms of strength. And so, in my opinion, that's where we kind of need to see some drop off in terms of these spells. I don't think we should be in this spot to where the tier 1.0 deck is a Siren Song, the tier 1.1 deck is Siren Song, and then the tier 1.2 deck is a Siren Song deck. I think that's like a little bit obnoxious, and that's where Riot has to start thinking about the space of the hotfix. But I think that the tier 1, tier 1.5, tier 2 deck is probably a fairly safe space to be for a spells based deck to really thrive. But it's also kind of interesting in terms of the champions, though, right? If you want to bring a champion to best of 3, an opponent just bans your Samira deck every time, you're left without playing that, one option. And so that is kind of the interesting space between the champions and then the spells-based things throughout the format, as to where you can just completely ban out a strategy when it's champion-based, where you can't ban out a strategy if it's spell-based. And so, it's interesting. Again, another place where I don't have the answers. I think it's another fun thought exercise that would be interesting to see a developer thoughts video or a developer thoughts article on. But as we kind of just ran through this meta to where Siren Song was so rampant, I feel like it was kind of an interesting thought thing to put forward, in the sense that this format being defined by a spell and not being defined by a champion. It's kind of interesting to see what the devs think on that. I don't think that this was a right or wrong answer kind of thing. I certainly don't have the answer for it. My thoughts on the meta were that it was fine. As the kids say these days, I feel like this meta was mid, right? It's kind of in the middle, right? It's not great. It's not bad. I know there was a lot of polarizing thoughts about the Siren Song meta, but I don't think it was that terrible. And so I certainly hated the Seraphine metas more, and I certainly loved some of the other metas more than this one, but I didn't have a bad time over the course of the past month. And so, with that thought stuff out of the way, we can actually pull up the patch notes, talk about those just a little bit more. And so over the course of watching the developer stream video, they said that this is a smaller balance patch, right? Typically, the balance patches seem to affect like 20 or 30 cards. Some of these in the past really kind of brought forth some old archetypes. I feel like there was the real big update to Daybreak came through the course of a balance patch, and Riot had their summer break over the course of this patch. And so they didn't put out as big of a patch. They made some notes in terms of some of the thoughts and ideas going into this patch will actually come forth in the upcoming variety patch. So it'll be about a month away from now, but just something to keep in mind. This one's a little bit smaller than the balance patches of old, and none of the real big themes of the day got brought forth. I think there's no reputation changes in this one, and so that was probably what Riot did on their week off for the 4th of July, right? They said, you mark your calendar things to do for the week, update reputation, and that just happened to fall on the 4th of July week, and so it didn't make it into the patch. I'm sure it'll happen with the next one. But to make our way through the patch notes, I'm just going to go through each of the cards individually. The Crimson Pigeon no longer gets a permanent bonus. I think that this is fine. I get the understanding behind it in the sense that the Crimson Pigeon attacking on, say, turn 2 and becoming a 3/3 and then becoming a 4/4 on turn 4 can snowball pretty quickly. If you ran into that space to where you couldn't deal with the pigeon on turn 2, then you typically couldn't deal with it on turn 4, and then the stats would just kind of snowball out of control. And so now it only gets the +1/+1 for the singular turn, and as a kind of, Noxan lover, it makes me feel kind of sad, but I think in kind of the design space of being able to add in additional good, cheap, aggressive one-cost units, it was probably a bit of a necessity, and so I think it's pretty reasonable. I think the Crimson Pigeon will still be the kind of headliner in both the aggressive Noxan decks and also any deck featuring Nico, but a little bit weaker along the way here. Up next, the coin. This is a very big update to where the coin becomes a focus spell instead of a burst spell. This is the absolute biggest nerf that we'll be seeing to the Karma set deck. They're no longer able to do this nonsense to where it's your attack token on turn 10, you open attack into the Karma deck and they say, LOL, I'm going to play 10 mana worth of spells, I'm going to coin back to 10, and then I'm going to play 2 concussive palms, and then I'm going to get more coins in hand and then just continue on this big chain. Your opponent can do this kind of nonsense on their attack token, but it really limits the Karma set's ability to combo off in the middle of your turn. It's going to take them a little bit more setup to really get that stuff going. And in terms the way I felt in terms of Karma set, I felt like the deck is fine from a power level perspective. I just didn't like running into these games to where it's not easily definable if you need to concede. And so you're just sitting there watching your opponent play solitaire. They may need 3 or 4 more turns to actually kind of figure out what they're doing, but you're just being held hostage by the game. I much more appreciate it as to where your opponent has their Zolani on board and you're like, oh yeah, I'm just fucking toast, right? And so I don't really care about this in that sense, but it does open up more design space for the remainder of the coins, as we'll see further on. And so, a bit of a nerf to Karma set, but the remainder of the coins can now be made stronger and given more of a chance to thrive. Up next is Kaisa. Kaisa loses out on her quick attack. Very big nerf to her. I was really surprised to see this one come in. This strikes me as something as to where I think during the Eternal meta, the Kaisa Garen deck was just at the top, and now with the release of Siren Song and the subsequent nerf and the things that are happening now, as you look at some of the units that came out, I should say the champions that came out in the new set, to where you have Nico, which is a very combat-oriented engine-based unit, and then you also have, oh my god, who was even the other champion in this set? It's just like nobody's even playing them. Everybody's just playing Siren Song. But it was some other just like combat-oriented champion. And if the format is evolving into a who can just put their big threat on the board fastest kind of thing, there's nothing more powerful you can do right now than Kaisa. And so I think this is probably a fairly good preemptive nerf. Take a little bit of the thunder out of Kaisa, make those games to where your opponent copies a Scout Challenger onto Kaisa right away. Not necessarily just such a gigantic blowout, right? She has to kind of make the decision of, do I want to challenge down an opposing 1 health unit that's going to die to the Acathian Rain, or do I want to challenge down a bigger unit at the threat of losing my unit? I think that that's all a fairly positive outcome for a card that was probably A, getting ready to get nutsos, and B, gets stronger as more keywords are released. You have a little bit more agency in the cards that you want to play. You don't really want to be playing a 1-cost fearsome lurk unit. You're just playing it for the keywords. And so as more units come out with keywords and you get a better selection of keywords to include in your Kaisa deck, she just gets stronger as time goes on. And so it's probably nice to just kind of weaken her now before she gets obnoxious. Up next, Powder Pandemonium, up to 7 mana. I think this is probably pretty reasonable. Powder Pandemonium was, a card that you could play at an early opportunity defensively, right? So if your opponent's attacking at you with elites, you had the opportunity to just say Powder Pandemonium for 3 to be ultra defensive for a round and then start pulling off your combo stuff on the next turn. That kind of attack pattern gets taken away from you quite a bit, while the late game flashiness of the 6 monkey summon is still available at 7. And so this is another kind of preemptive nerf as to where Riot is attacking those decks that were extremely strong in the Eternal month, whatever that previous metagame was, to where the Kaisa deck and the Samira Fizz deck were at the top of the meta. Didn't want them to just revert directly back to just being the new top decks, even though everyone was just playing Eternal that month. Up next, the Legionary Charge. Ruben Zhu made some interesting thoughts on this one in the developer video, in the sense that this is a very restrictive card in terms of card design, right? This is a card to where the only real play it sees is predominantly out of the Rumble decks, right? You play Rumble as your only unit that has 5 attack, you just draw your Rumble with it, and to a lesser degree it saw some play in the Mistwraith decks to summon up Nocturne, but that wasn't kind of like the real key play to do it. But it did limit Riot in the sense that if you play only that 1 5 attack unit in your deck, you can essentially tutor for it with the Legionary Charge, and then you have to really start to consider every other champion that you prevent throughout the remainder of the game as to whether or not they should be tutorable by Legionary Charge. And so just kind of preemptively nerfing it a little bit, makes a bit of sense. I'm sure we'll get a Reputation champion in the next patch to make up with the Legionary Charge. But I think that makes a lot of sense. If you weren't familiar with Stoneforge Mystic, that's the one that I talk about in terms of Magic quite a bit, as to where Stoneforge Mystic let you both tutor for an equipment and then also put it into play cheaper. And so you couldn't just nerf all of the equipment from that point forward. You had to design every equipment with the Stoneforge Mystic in mind, and that's really kind of a limiting factor, right? Equipment are kind of a core thought in these fantasy games, right? You give your unit a big ass sword, you give them the Infinity Edge, whatever you're doing. You don't want to have to consider all of those because of a single card in the past. And so nerfing up the Legionary Charge makes sense. You just remove it from the game you want, as far as I'm concerned. Up next, the Plaza Guardian reduced from 6/6 to 5/5. I'm not certain where the Plaza Guardian stood in terms of standard. I know I saw some people trying to play the Plaza Guardian decks in terms of their open lineup. I don't think that they had too much success, but as Siren Song got nerfed, there is the opportunity for the Plaza Guardian deck to really pop off in standard, and then it was one of the most popular decks in Eternal, and so it was probably a little bit due. Dropping it from a 6/6 to a 5/5, that really kind of opens up a lot of spots in terms of how hard the opposing deck can OTK you with a board full of Plaza Guardians, right? In terms of just these small number of stats, it would just be 4 either way, right? 4 5/5s will deal 20, and then 4 6/6s will also deal the 20. But as you start developing in one blocker, right, dealing 15 and dealing 18 is quite a big difference. And so it's probably worth the drop there. Up next, Siren Song, big nerf to it. Riot didn't take any chances, taking it straight up to 6 from 4. I think this is kind of interesting, and if we look back at a card like Spirits Unleashed, as to where it cost 5, it saw quite a bit of play, but it didn't really kind of take over the meta. I think Siren Song still had that kind of space to take over the meta at 5, if you want to even still consider, well, maybe you play a Shell Shocker on turn 1, and then you still get to play Siren Song on turn 3 and have a unit on board. I think that's all well and good, and then we'll see if this can really kind of fit in elsewhere. I'd seen some thoughts on cards in the past as to where you have kind of alternate conditions on the casting cost to make it kind of more palatable for the theme that it's in. And so if you want to look at a card like Pirouette, Pirouette is a just highly efficient spell in terms of being able to stun and deal the point of damage and everything, but it also feeds into the plunder mechanic. And so how do you make it, strong in plunder but weaker to the other decks in the format? You say, well, the card costs 3, but the plunder takes it down to cost 1 mana, right? And so I'm curious if there wasn't a place for Siren Song to where it couldn't still buff Lucian and say things like, Siren Song costs 1 less for each unit that's died this game, or if it couldn't buff Evelyn and saying something like Siren Song costs 1 less for every Husk you've summoned this game, right? There are some levers that Riot can pull to make this card more palatable to a Husks deck, but not just take over the meta to where every single deck in the format wants to play it. And I'm curious if that kind of thing doesn't happen in the future. And so we'll see, you get your break from the Siren Song as it turns out, but I think it's still a reasonably strong card. I mean, these cards that give bonuses to units everywhere have been strong over the history of the game, right? The Legion Deserter had to have a bunch of nerfs happen to him. Spirits Unleashed is a card that I feel like was undervalued and was just kind of waiting to pop off. Things like the Mist Wraiths are exceptionally powerful in terms of high-powered aggro decks, and so you really have to kind of be careful when it comes to these everywhere themes, and I think there might still be a world for the Siren Song. But moving forward, Risky Venture. This is the one that, watching the stream, a bunch of people in the stream were immediately calling this a nerf. That is nonsense. There is such a huge divider between dealing 2 damage and dealing 3. Risky Venture dealing 3 damage now makes it exceptionally playable and exceptionally powerful. And so I'm not trying to say that this is a card that's now going to come in and kind of take over the meta, but would you play a slow spell that dealt 3 damage to a unit for 2 mana? Yeah, I mean, that would be playable. Things like Mushroom Popper, whatever that thing is, like there's the Puff Cap card that occasionally sees play. There's a lot of kind of situational cards that cost 2 mana and deal 3 damage that find their way into being played. And I think Risky Venture can really kind of fit in that space. Bilgewater's already fucking terrible at dealing with units, and so this is kind of a splashy thing for them to have. But when a card creates a card, that's always something to take note of. And when you have access to these coins and you get to kind of store the mana up for later, that's another thing to take note of. And so again, I don't think the Risky Venture is going to come in and take over the meta, but you do need to be aware that it's here, and it is also Jack's flip card. And so if Jack starts to see more play in the meta, you need to be aware of the Risky Ventures coming in and being a thing. So up next, Hush. Very interesting in the sense that this is a card, I can't remember the trajectory of Hush. I think it was the 2-cost thing that put a copy of itself into your hand so you could Hush 4 and 5 times in the same turn. They said that was way too powerful, and so we're going to make it cost 3. And then they eventually said that's way too powerful. We're going to take away the copy thing so you only get to do it once. Now at 3 mana, it's not good enough, and so we need to make it cost 2. And so it's been quite the path for Hush. And I think Ruben Zoo mentioned in the video that the big kind of defining factor in a lot of the problems with Hush have been equipment. This is one of the things that I've stated kind of over and over and over again as we entered this meta, as to where the answer to Siren Song card is Hushes. The answer to your opponent playing Hushes is to play equipment, and that's where we see kind of the Jack's Orn decks start to popularize themselves over the course of the past month. And seeing kind of Hush drop in cost is quite interesting in that sense. But with it also being attached to Targonian Tellstones, I'm very interested to see how this plays out. The Targonian Tellstones, arguably the best Tellstones in the game right now, and having that get buffed again, right, with the nerf to Blessing of Targon last patch, now the Hush update this patch, gives you a whole lot of incentive to really kind of come in and play those Tellstones, because it's just one of the most versatile ones in the game, having the kind of ultimate top end being the Invoke. And so quite strong there. Of course, we won't play any Targon, because who plays these dumb cards, right? But Noxus, play it. Demacia, play it. Everything else, get it out of here, right? But something to kind of take note of there. Up next, I feel like this is one of the most understated update in the patch, is the change to Rhinefang Pack. And so Rhinefang Pack used to be a 1/1, or it was I believe it was a 1/1. And then when you played it, it got a bonus for every Frostbite that you did. And so now it has this kind of progressive effect to it, right? And so it comes down as a 0/4, but every time you play a Frostbite in the game, it gets this progressive bonus. And so if you play your Frozen and Fear on turn 3, it's going to generate a 0/4. It's going to get the +1 attack because you've played the singular Frostbite. But then on the next turn, if you play a Harsh Winds, your Rhinefang Pack that's already on the board is going to grow up to a 3/4. And that stat line there is where things start to get really interesting, right? It has 2 big things going for it. Has 4 health, which is astronomically important. That just lets you combat literally every single unit in the game and survive. And so having 4 health is exceptionally strong. And I think the kind of key with this Rhinefang Pack is going to be, how quickly can we get it up to 3 attack without really putting a lot of effort into it, right? Getting a 3/4 out of some of these spells and abilities is where the kind of real break point is going to be for this unit. And that's where I'm kind of interested to see how it comes out and about. And so I think this update here is, probably the biggest one to me in terms of gameplay, and having the update to the Rhinefang Wolf, or the Rhinefang Pack, just incredibly powerful. Also has the dog keyword attached to it, so if you're looking to play your Warden of the Tribes deck or whatnot, it does have a relevant keyword. And then also in terms of, say, playing the Omen Hawk into one of these flash freezes, that now gives you the second subtype to do some other stuff. Very interesting. This is my kind of pick as being the most powerful thing coming out of the balance patch, and I think we're actually going to see quite a bit of play out of these things, whether or not it's in some kind of subtype matters deck, or if it's in a Ash deck or a Frostbite based deck, or if it's just a value play coming out of something. I think the Rhinefang Pack is going to be exceptionally relevant in this upcoming meta. Up next, we have the changes to Jack. A little out of order. We talked about the risky business earlier, but Jack has this heal ability attached to him, and I think this is quite interesting in terms of There are a lot of brawler type units in League of Legends that can, heal themselves and regenerate. I actually had to go and see if Soraka was still in the standard format, right? Are we going to have to really deal with, Tom Kench, get out of here? It's Jack and Soraka coming to the party now, as, Jack gets to heal multiple times in the same turn, and then you have your Soraka leveling up super quick. I was curious if that was going to be a thing. She's not in the meta, but this heal thing is very relevant and very powerful, and so I think this is the kind of thing that can push Jack a little further up into the meta, because he has a lot going on for him now, right? He has Brash, so he has this evasive ability, he has the ability to generate coins, and now he also has this ability to heal himself along the way, and then his level 2 ability granting him Overwhelm. You have a lot going for you on a singular card, and I feel like this is probably what it takes to actually push Jack up into relevance. And so I don't think we're going to see the Bilgewater coin thing really matter. I don't think the changes to Risky Business and Jack and Angel, as we'll see in a moment, are enough to make us want to come out and really play the coin-based decks. But in a lot of the ways that we see Samira see play is to where Samira just does a ton of stuff. We see Action see play because Action just does a ton of stuff. They don't do anything spectacular at once, right? They're kind of the death by 1,000 cuts measure, as to where, you play your Samira and then she generates a spell, and then you get a challenge, and then she generates another spell, and then you discard that spell to something, and then she levels up, and now you're threatening to get these rallies. Like, nothing is quick about the death that Samira brings, but Samira killed you like 4 turns ago. You just didn't realize it, right? I think that's the kind of thing that we can get out of Jack now, is to where he doesn't do anything big and spectacular at once, but he, comes down, gets an attack in, he heals up a little bit, he controls the board for a while, he eventually flips, you play a coin to get a spell down a little bit cheaper, and then he gets a big overwhelm attack in. Like, none of that happens quickly, but over the course of a game, it adds up a whole lot, and he gives you a big kind of complete package at the end of the day. Alright, so up next, we mentioned her, Angel, right? She now has this plunder, create 3 coins in hand, and so I'm not entirely certain what kind of nonsense we're going to get out of this, right? This is a pure upgrade to Angel, right? Losing 1 point of attack for this big plunder ability is quite the thing. If there is a big build-around coin thing coming out of Bilgewater, I guess Angel will have to be a part of it, but I don't really feel like this is going to be a strong thing. I feel like this is something to where you can do obnoxious stuff in the Path of Champions, but it's not something that's really going to translate over into Standard. And so, a bit unfortunate for her. I'm curious to see what the deck builders can really do with this plunder aspect, but I don't think that she's going to be combat relevant. I really don't think we're going to see too much of the Jack removal spell. I don't think we're going to see too much of Angel, but I think we're going to see a big uptick in Jack, kind of filling in that Twisted Fate role, right, to where he just does a lot of utility, but doesn't outright win you any games. Up next, we have the Bakai Witherclaw. Now gets to deliver vulnerable to an opposing unit, and I think this is a reasonable thing to continue adding to the Shurima units, right? Having this Merciless Hunter ability granting vulnerable to opposing stuff, and now you get to try and make quick attack challenges with your Nidalees and with your actions and the like. I feel like that's probably a pretty healthy theme to be kind of adding into Shurima, and being their kind of defining thing in terms of how combats work, right? As to where PNZ is good at damage-based removal spells, and then you move over to Noxus, and they kind of have fight cards, and Demacia has strike cards, and then what is Shurima's thing? Shurima's thing, granting vulnerable, I think is, fine and interesting and neat, but they got to kind of flesh it out a little bit more. Updating the Witherclaw is a way to do that. I don't think this is going to see any play, but I do like to see this theme kind of reinforced as time goes on. Up next, Faithful Watchdog. I think this update is absolutely fantastic. It now forges an equipment as it comes into play. I'm very interested in coming in and building around this card, as the equipment themes are so incredibly strong. And so I immediately thought towards the Vayne Jarvan Freylord deck that Infinity Patrons hit rank 1 on the ladder with a few months ago. We hit the top cut of the Eternal Open last month with a very similar idea, and the Faithful Watchdog is incredibly happy to kind of fit into that theme. And so if you're able to have these curves to where on turn 1 you play the Apprentice Weaponsmith. Turn 2, you just bank up a couple of mana. Turn 3, you play the Faithful Watchdog. It equips itself with a Darken equipment. That Darken equipment now gets +2/+2, and then you still have 2 mana hanging out to play a combat trick with or whatever. Very, very powerful curve, giving that Darken equipment the bonus forever. And so I'm quite curious to see if the Faithful Watchdog fits itself into some kind of Vayne shell, because this Forge attachment to it now is just so incredibly strong. And so very powerful update for the dog. Quite interested to see where that one goes. Up next, we do have the Aurora Borealis. I mean, the Poro King was good as a bad Siren Song deck, and taking away the Siren Song from the Poro King doesn't really make me feel like the Aurora Borealis is the answer. And so again, this feels kind of like a Path of Champions update to me. Or if you want to meme it up a bit on the ladder, you can add this to your Poro King deck. But this is certainly not enough to push the Poros into ladder relevance. Last but not least, we have a little bit of section of subtype updates. Warden of the Tribes, I'm kind of interested in. At what point do we say that this is just enough stats, right? If he comes down and gives your board +2/+2 while also having this giant overwhelm unit, that's pretty close to the Winding Light without taking much effort. And so, I could see him definitely being relevant at this point. At 8 mana instead of 9. That's a pretty big break point in terms of in-game play. And so I could see this being kind of relevant, but probably only as like a one-of, right? I think that this may have just entered that space of being a Captain Farron, is to where you play one copy, and if the game goes that super late, then you have your big finisher for the end of the day. But I don't think we're going to really see any Warden of the Tribes build-arounds, although I do concede this is a ton of stats to come out of a unit. I just think that the kind of break point for including 3 copies of a big expensive dude is 7, and 8 is just a little bit too much beyond that singular copy. Off to the right, we have the Crested Lionhawk. I don't know what they're trying to do with this card. It's fucking weird. It costs 6 mana, has a bunch of weird stats, doesn't really do anything. I don't know. Maybe if Lux is popular again, this will be kind of interesting in being able to generate a 6-cost spell for Lux or something. It just feels like a really weird kind of Demacian style card, kind of pigeonholing this card generation ability into this thing. And so, it is what it is. I do like seeing cards like this have manifested Demacian spell. I really don't like when you come down and play against Seraphine and she gets to generate her cards from the entirety of the card library. I really like how they hone it in and say that this card can manifest within your regions. I like that they're taking it a step further with the Lionhawk only generating Demacian cards, but there's just not a world where this is going to see play. In most of the kind of unit-based decks, there's so much to fight with. It's 6-cost in Demacia, right? There's Cythria, there's Genevieve, there's things like Jarvan. You have to be like really high impact to fit, and so this needs to fit into some kind of like value-y Lux deck that doesn't care about that top-end attackiness, and I feel like that just doesn't do enough in those decks. And so, I don't know, you could make this an 8/8, maybe it's relevant. I don't think that 6/6 is enough. Last but not least is the Glacial Saurion, and this is relevant, attaching Overwhelm to this thing. He starts to fit into the space now to where you can just play him in any deck, right? Having him just be kind of this big Omen Hawk that has Overwhelm is incredibly powerful, and then if you do manage to hit on the subtype draw card, that's an incredibly powerful space to be in. And so this is the kind of upgrade that switches your card into being now relevant and fitting in a wide swath of decks. And so I'm curious to see if he fits in the Nico decks, curious to see what Rico Rex does with this, guys. Rico Rex is probably just salivating at this thing, saying, oh boy, you gave me another Overwhelm unit, time to hit rank 1 on the ladder again. But I think this is very interesting and powerful, and it's going to see a lot of play across the board. And this really strikes me as the kind of card as to where if you are trying to say, okay, let's get in the space in terms of design, as to where units are getting on the board and just dealing battle with each other and not really trying to be in a space to where, let's play a really powerful spell like Siren Song or Champion Strength. Cards like Glacial Sarion are really what fits the bill there, right? It's a very efficient unit. It does a lot, has some keywords, it has a subtype, it's combat relevant, it boosts the units in your deck, it helps close out the games at the end of the day. It's all around just a really big value play that promotes combats for the rest of the game. I think it's a very powerful and strong idea coming on with this card. Last but not least, there are a couple of other things in the patch notes to really call out, and so there are a bunch of skin upgrades. They aren't going to mention what they are until tomorrow, and so I'm interested to see what skins are going to be upgraded. We love paying the pay-to-win price and getting all of the new skins out there, so I'm curious to see what comes out of that. And the one that was really kind of interesting and dumb to me at the same time was the Shadows in the Brush one, and so the Shadows in the Brush was prismatic based on what your card did, and so the idea being if you played a prismatic Shadows in the Brush, it probably wasn't Nidalee, right? Because you have to spend so much more money to make Nidalee prismatic as opposed to Trooper, whatever, Sand Summoning Trooper, whatever he's called. And so if you saw the prismatic card, it probably wasn't the champion. And so I don't like this idea of just not making any of them prismatic. That's kind of bullshit to me because I want all my stuff to be prismatic. If you really wanted to have the option, you can go to your collection and say make nothing prismatic, right? And so why do you have to just like limit it now? So because some dumb was like, my opponent big brained me because my Nidalee's not prismatic. Just go push the fucking button in your collection, right? I want all my stuff to be prismatic. Don't take that away from me. And so I'm going to quit paying the pay-to-win price now, right? Right? We're getting that out of here. Never paying to win ever again because of this change right here. Riot, you'll never get another dollar from me. That's crazy talk right there. I'm ready to buy some more skins as it is, but I think that's kind of a bullshit update, but is what it is. And so, that's it. That's our patch notes review. Agree or disagree with anything we'd said, we'd love to hear about it. Feel free to post in the comments. And as I said at the beginning, for you regular followers still here at the end, I'll crank out a couple of videos over the course of the next few days. There's going to be a dead spot from where the family's coming to town and I can't make videos while they're here. But we'll be back to our regularly scheduled daily video shortly next week, ideally around Tuesday or Wednesday or so. And so, that's it. Glad to have you here. This is Bust. We thank you for stopping by.